Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, aka Possibility Man. We are committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Today, our guest is Dr. Lee Ostler. Dr. Ostler studied biology, zoology, and biochemistry and physiology at Brigham Young University. He earned his Doctor of Dental Surgery degree from the University of Washington. He is a founding member and former president of the American Academy for Oral Systemic Health. Dr. Ostler is a scholar and a teacher of health professionals. He has recently published two big books, Redox Matters and Healthy Matters. Dr. Ostler, two big books back to back, 2021 and 2022. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Stephen. It's such a pleasure to be with you today and to speak to you and your guests. I'm delighted and thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know, these are some amazing books and we're going to plug into them. I read them and I was so inspired by both of them, but especially Healthy Matters. And reading it, I got it from my desk. I went to my kitchen, pulled out a carrot, peeled it, got half of a tomato, and began to consume good foods. These are remarkable works, and I thank you for devoting your time to doing them. Let's get to the definition of terms. What is meant by redox? This title, this word, appears in your first book, Redox. What does this mean?
Well, that's a great foundation question because little of this makes sense unless we understand what redox is. This is a new concept, although the word itself is very old. I mean, we've understood redox, which is an acronym, or it's a contraction for the word reduction, oxidation. And basically it's a chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry explanation of how molecules operate, how electrons are transferred from one molecule to another. And in the world of biological life, specifically, which is our focus here, it's the movement of those electrons that really define life and that give the energy to life. And how those electrons move about is based on their electrical charge and the balance of charge that's left with an atom. And again, without going too deep into the chemistry rabbit hole, as it were, these are the biological foundations for which biology works. We call it redox biology, and the foundation of energy. How we obtain energy, when we eat food, and what we do with it, and how it's converted into energy, as well as all the coordinating mechanisms and processes that the body and the cells use to manage the business or the affairs of staying alive, being biologically functional. It's all about this reduction and oxidation process of electrons moving around. Mm-hmm. That's at the core. And I realize that probably still over the head of many who are listening into this, but that is really what redox is. And the fun part is that it's now kind of taking on a new level of interest, a new level of understanding. There's been some breakthroughs that have happened recently that have made this more pertinent. But redox as a concept is as old as dirt. It's as old as oxygen. It's just it's the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've already touched on it, but I want to ask again: why is redox important to human beings?
Well, to all human beings, we could actually bring mammals and animals into that. But for human cells to function, there has to be a degree of coordination. There has to be a degree of signaling. And here's kind of the ultimate operational question. We all know and understand we live in a world of stress and issues and disease and so forth. But the question is, how does a cell, how does a body, how does tissue, how does a cell understand or know when it's in trouble? When it has a problem that could be significant, how does it know that it has a problem? And then the second follow-up is, what does it do about it? And the mechanism or the processes attached to those two questions is really, the answer of why is redox important? Because if we had no ability to sense or detect the world that we live in, then the threats or the stresses that are imposed upon us through everyday living, that includes, the amount of oxygen we have, the toxicity around us or that is in our food, environmental or produced radiation levels, and so on and so forth. All of those would have an effect, and we wouldn't be able to respond to the stress. And so that's, fundamentally, that's what's hardwired into our biology. That's how our cells are designed to work, is to be able to detect that and to respond in an adaptive way so that we can continue to survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love these books, and I love them because even though they deal with science, I found that they're also accessible. And to the reader, and I don't have a science background, but readers will encounter the phrase cell signaling in your books. What is that, cell signaling?
It's a great question, and it kind of piggybacks off what we were just talking about. If a cell detects that it is in trouble, for example, let's say that it begins to experience reduced levels of oxygen, or it experiences radiation or toxicity, or some degree of nutritional stress. That we kind of leave it vague at the moment, but the question is, how does it know to respond? And cell signaling is this movement of electrons. We call it transduction, where an electron moves from one molecule to the next, and in that movement, it has there's a response pathway that is invoked that's based on these redox principles of how electrons move, such that at the end of that communication process, there is what's called an effector, or a response, or a result, or an outcome from that process that just got set in motion. And so we use the term communication. We humans speak to each other with our mouths, and we have a brain that helps us form words, and we communicate that way because we're sentient beings. But how does that work in cells? In a soup of chemicals, in a soup of saline. How does this process go from one place or one molecule to another one? And the answer is that it's signaling, or it's having an effect because of a consequence of an action, which is the movement of these electrons. I mean, you can think of a cell as, if you've ever been to a rock concert, they have a mosh pit down next to the stage where the band is playing. And it seems anymore that in those mosh pits, the concert goers they're just bouncing around and jumping and hopping and bumping into each other. And in a manner of speaking, that's kind of what's going on inside our cells. We have this cytoplasm or soup of cellular fluid that's basically saline. But we have all these ingredients, all these molecules and proteins and fat molecules and so forth, and DNA. And they're in there in some degree of concentration. And when something comes upon them to produce a consequence or an effect, they're bouncing into each other and trading information as a consequence of what's going on in their environment. And the outcome of that is biological life, because the processes of life, of protein fabrication, from the DNA, from the immune system becoming activated when it is assaulted or insulted by something foreign, all of that happens because it was first signaled into the process.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I'm bubbling because I'm so excited to hear these books, because you're telling me that there are a lot of chemical, biological processes that goes on in the human body, but you're also telling me how to take care of myself. Now, but before we get into that, of how a human being can live for optimal health, I want to take a look at the challenges that we face as a society, as a world, when it comes to healthcare. So, in these books, people will encounter something about the healthcare crisis, or I'm going to call it now the disease management crisis. So I want you to walk us through the challenges we face as a society, starting with chronic disease and how we currently handle them.
Yeah, that's a really deep and very often controversial subject. And obviously it depends on what one's vested interests are, what their worldview is perhaps, but just speaking to the essence of what is health, that might be a good place to start. And we have this notion that health management is utilizing, we'll call it intervention, medical intervention in a manner such that I don't have symptoms. If I can use medication to keep my blood pressure in a normal range, I have intervened, and one would say, well, I'm healthy. I'm adequately managing my problem. We could say the same thing about cholesterol levels or any other symptomology of any disease process that you might have. And we have an industry that is oriented around this idea of taking care of the body when things go badly. The more fundamental question is, why did they go badly in the first place? And what's going on in the larger societal realm to make it such that my cells don't function properly? If we start with the premise that if a cell is given everything that it needs to be healthy in the first place, it's very rare or seldom that it would ever produce a dysfunction or a disease as an outcome that would require a medical intervention. So when we go back and strip this down to kind of the basics, we say that here we are as human beings living in a world, and we have to consume food to stay alive. We call that metabolism. And by and large, the diseases, the chronic diseases, especially the metabolic-based diseases that we are experiencing today, which is about 75% of our healthcare dollar, and at least 75, if not 90% of our healthcare time is spent managing diseases of a chronic lifestyle-based metabolic nature that arise from cells not working properly. Well, if we back that back down and we just say, well, what if we could go in and correct those at the most foundational level? Or another way of saying is that we could go upstream in the process, up to the headwaters, to the fountain of where this began. If we could make corrections there and maintain those corrections, then the cells stay functioning right. And we don't veer off left or right into disease waters that require a medical intervention or a medication or a surgery of some kind to get rid of the problem that developed or to maintain. And I'm not saying, this is kind of the metaphor I have. The analogy is as a cliff. It's the health cliff, yeah. And we all kind of fall off the cliff, at one time or another. But it does no use to badmouth the medical establishment for being at the bottom of the cliff when we're the ones falling over the edge of it. When we fall over the edge of the cliff and we're at the bottom, we need a heart surgeon. We need medical intervention to get us back up on our feet. The real question is, why did I fall off the edge of the cliff? And so there's both sides of this equation are needed and are necessary, especially in a pragmatic way, in our civilization. But this is begging the question of, what does it take to stay away from the edge of the cliff? And all of this comes back to our cellular environment. It has to do with diet. And so for decades, we have gone through this, I don't know, it's kind of been a slow morph, if you will, kind of a slow devolution or evolution, where our diets, are the things that we consume, have changed. We aren't eating the same way that we have historically eaten. Our ancestors ate very differently than us, and this kind of goes to one of the basic tenets of what I write about in Healthy Matters is that our ancestors lived in a world that didn't guarantee a food supply. You can mince that in any direction that you want, but today, we have maybe a 20-foot commute to the refrigerator and there's food on demand, and we can go to any grocery store in the country and there's plentiful food. But that wasn't the way it was, decades or centuries or millennia ago. And so the body is designed to be able to withstand the stress of not having food in plentiful amounts. And because of those designs, it's learned how to adapt or be responsive to changing conditions. And therein is one of the keys. We can probably get into this a little bit later, but therein is one of the keys to staying healthy. And that is to become response-abled, to be able to adapt to stresses that come along, and even to manufacture those stresses periodically through behaviors of eating and energy metabolism that allow my body the opportunity to rise to the challenge and strengthen and resist all those problems. So,
yeah, that's great. What I also like about your book, and you mentioned it a moment ago, when you talk about the cliff, if you fall off the cliff, you may need a trauma center to take care of it. You don't dismiss the medical establishment, but you're also saying human beings can be empowered. Is that about right? And I think this is what the second book, Healthy Matters, Redox Lifestyle, is all about as well, that people can be empowered.
Yeah, well, think about what lifestyle means. We all accept it as fact today that if you exercise and you eat right, however you want to define that, but if you eat right and exercise and reduce your stress, manage your stress, get adequate oxygen, you don't have, an impaired airway while you sleep, and you're sleeping, as your body needs. If we do those things and we exercise, that we're going to be healthy. Or healthier, right? And I get there's genetics and there's other issues that come into play, but just as a generalization, the question is why? Why does exercise and good nutrition and stress reduction and adequate sleep and having good gut health, why does that make you healthy? And the answer is because it has a play, or it has an impact upon these redox pathways. Getting back to your earlier question and kind of tying this together, the essence of cellular communication is how we turn on protective or cell protective defenses that we're programmed with. Again, back to how do I detect a problem? Once I've detected it, if I can then turn on the cellular defense processes, the mechanisms that protect me and keep me healthy, then I'm going to have less disease. Well, that's what this lifestyle is about. And over the decades, we've kind of deconstructed this redox lifestyle. We didn't know to call it redox, 1,000 years ago. We just knew that eating right and getting a lot of physical activity and growing your food closer to where you eat it, and not putting chemicals in our food to make it last forever, and so on and so forth. That's just the way they lived back then. But now we have to understand these nuances, because that whole lifestyle of the way we lived has been deconstructed, and now it's convenience, it's fast, it's processed, and that's toxic to these cellular communication pathways. So one of the main theses I have in writing these books is that by understanding the rules of the cell, that I can then make informed choices that will inform my behavior in a way that I can make different choices, and I can govern myself differently to have a better, healthier outcome. And again, it doesn't mean that I may not need medication for this, that, or the other. There's things that we don't always have in our control, such as, who our parents were and what happened, in earlier parts of our life. Some consequences we have to live with as we get older. But the point is, if I can live by the way the rules of the cell dictate, then I'm at choice, and I have a better outcome. And we mostly don't understand those rules. And I think if we did understand the rules, then we could reverse engineer our lifestyle. We could reverse engineer our diet, because it would be purposeful eating. And we would be understanding that if I ate outside of those boundaries, there's going to be a consequence that my cells will experience, even though I don't feel it right away. there's a consequence. But if I eat within those rules, within those boundaries, then I'm going to have a better healthy outcome.
Right. Yeah. What this reminds me of, if a person goes to get an examination, lipid panel in their cholesterol turns up high, sometimes some doctors, not all, first step would be to give a medication. And the person wants the medication. What I hear from you, though, is that there's some other, a lifestyle could be a pathway to disease, but a lifestyle, what I hear from you, could be a pathway to good health. Is that about right? Lifestyle in terms of food. And of course, we can add to that how we care for ourselves in terms of exercise and the like.
Exactly. And the reason why is because the lifestyle is what activates those pathways. Mm-hmm. That's what activates the signaling pathways from the mitochondria into the rest of the cell to begin the mechanistic or the processing pathways that become my defense. Mm-hmm. And if I let my shields down and I don't have the defense that I need, then I'm at risk. Yeah. And so, it's not a guarantee because life's not a guarantee, but I'm trying to stack the deck in my favor as much as I can.
Sure. I mean, your books empowered me, and I might have had a box of cookies as my snack as I did my work this morning, but I have some broccoli as my snack. So I feel, with knowledge that I can make better choices. And because of your book, I'm making a better choice instead of a packaged snack, a real food snack. What do you think?
Well, I think that's great. And, there's an emotional, spiritual side to that about feeling better, maybe it's a conscious thing, I don't know, but from a metabolic point of view, again, if you go back to what are the rules of the cell, one of the things, and I think it's a myth, and I'm not here to create a food fight with other people, that have different understandings or ideologies about it. But if I just strip it down and just say, what happens to a cell when I flood it with glucose? When I eat a lot of carbohydrates, especially if they're processed and refined, what goes on inside a cell the second that I consume that? And the answer is it's having a glorious feast. It's burning and metabolizing that fuel, and it produces a spiking elevation of glucose in my bloodstream. And I'm kind of happy. I'm satiated. That hits my reward center in my brain, and it says, "Way to go! Let's do that again in 30 minutes." And we just kind of stay in this constant fed state, and there's a lot of people who advocate that is an important adaptation that we should follow. Is that otherwise, because we don't want to get hungry. Well, if you go back and look at how cells function, what happens when I deprive cells of glucose? If I don't eat the carbohydrates, for example, what if I fasted and I just simply didn't eat for 8 or 12 or 16 hours? What happens to the glucose levels in my cell? Well, the glucose drops, and most people, who depend on that will start to feel somewhat agitated. That's a moment of stress. But as I become practiced in my ability to do that, if I'm conditioning the cells in that regard, eventually they will automatically source their fuel from different sources, meaning fats and proteins. And there's kind of a magical thing that happens, and it's actually not magic, it's just physiology, but there's this magic thing that happens in the cell when it starts to burn fats, is that it produces ketones. And ketones act as an inside source of fuel, an alternative fuel, and the brain loves those. And I become fat burning. I become fat adapted. And I will do that for a period of time. This is a state of called a physiology called ketosis. And and we do that every night, when we eat supper and then we go to bed. We don't eat for 8 or 10 or 12 hours. Well, our blood sugar drops. And for most of us, that's a really healthy thing, because it's during those moments when I'm having just a slight bit of that ketosis nutritional stress that I turn on a process called autophagy, AUTOPHAGY. That is, think of that as like the Pac-Mans, in the old video game days, the early video games had Pac-Man, and the Pac-Man would come along, but that Pac-Man goes through our brain cells and all our other cells, and is eating up or is digesting all of the damaged proteins and all the cellular parts that are dysfunctional from the previous day's work, the metabolism of the day. And if I stay in a constant state of elevated glucose, if I'm eating midnight snacks so that I can never get into that low glucose state, it becomes very difficult to activate that autophagy cellular renewal process. And so there's some design in the idea that if I deprived myself of glucose, and you can do that with some low carb eating, you can do it with fasting, you can do it through intense exercise that will burn up more glucose. However I get to that place, I'm now creating a mild amount of nutritional stress in my cells, and it responds accordingly in healthy ways. And it's not permanent. You don't eat that way all the time, 24/7, 365. You cycle in and out of it. That's why we break the fast every morning. And if we, instead of a carbohydrate breakfast once in a while, if you had a fat and protein breakfast once in a while, you could extend that state and activate these processes for more hours of the day. That's playing on this cellular biochemistry, this redox biology, physiology, and understanding those. Now you can manipulate, like you said, you ate broccoli. Well, that's a complex carbohydrate. It's a very complex, it's very difficult and slow to be digested, as opposed to bread flour that, or have a tablespoon of table sugar. It's like that goes straight into your bloodstream quickly. Mm-hmm. Well, if I can slow that process down and I can meter or govern the rate at which those carbohydrates enter my bloodstream, I think I can begin to live this lifestyle that favors these cellular processes that are creating antioxidants inside me, as well as this cellular renewal processing that goes on. That's just the way our cells were designed.
Okay. Yeah. Now, in your book, though, you acknowledge, at least as I read you, because I could imagine someone saying, look, how can I follow a healthy lifestyle? I got a convenience store up the street. You mentioned it in your book. I got Burger King and a lot of other fast food joints. Some of them sell you a triple decker with bacon, on the sandwich. And then you go to the store. You got the cookie section. You got the meat section. Plus, Dr. Ostler, I got all of these ads coming at me from pharmaceuticals about this drug and that drug. Someone could say, wait a minute, what can I do about this? But give into the system. How would you respond to them?
Well, in my opinion, this is where you can step on a lot of toes, because everybody has their ideology and their own habits. But again, I'm just trying to speak to the principles. The first one of the rules that I call is a Redox Lifestyle rule. It kind of bumps up against what you were just talking about, and that is be clean. If I poison the cellular environment with toxins, then I'm going to use the word clean, and that physiologically things aren't going to function, optimally. And so what might that look like? And again, without calling out, the names of our favorite food sources and so forth, if we just said, well, what if it's processed food? If it's processed, then I have a problem, or I probably will have a problem eventually if I continue to eat those processed foods. And again, I go back to the principles. Is it wrong to eat carbohydrates? Well, no. But if I'm going to eat a carbohydrate, what kind of a carbohydrate should I be eating? Because I can only eat three things. I can eat carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are the macronutrients that I require for energy. Let me back up just a moment so people get the idea. If we went camping and we built a fire to cook our food on, we'd throw some logs in the fireplace and we'd strike a match, and we've got plenty of oxygen available, and so the fire starts to burn. From a physics or a chemistry point of view, the electrons in the fuel, in the logs that I'm burning, in its reduced form those electrons are being transferred to oxygen molecules. And water is created, which we don't see because it vaporizes and evaporates in the air. But the byproduct of that is heat. We warm our food in our hands. Well, in a similar way, when we consume food, we're putting logs on the fire. That fuel that we're combusting or metabolizing in our mitochondria is giving up these electrons to oxygen. And in that process, or in that transfer, energy is created. We harvest that energy in our cells and use it for our heartbeat and our brain cells and for life itself. That's how we create energy. But the smoke that's created, and I use that in quote marks, the byproducts that are created in that energy combustion or metabolism are these redox or reactive molecules. We call them reactive oxygen species, or ROS. Those are the redox molecules that the cell utilizes now to conduct this communication network. Mm-hmm. And depending on the level, whether you have a lot of them or a little of them, determines what processes become activated. For example, inflammation or antioxidant protection. And we can choose which pathway is activated by the kind of fuel we put on the fire to burn in the first place. So coming back to this point of saying, well, if I'm just starting the game and I just say, yeah, I know I need to change, my diet, and I need to alter the fuel that I'm putting on the fire so I get better outcomes. It's like, where can I start? Mm-hmm. And a good place to start is what you can get rid of. It's what you stop. And really quickly, you can look at food labels and say, I don't want added sugar. I don't want fructose. Fructose is metabolized very differently in the body than even just ordinary, normal sugar. 100% of it is, for the most part, is metabolized in the liver cells, whereas other forms of sugars that we get from carbohydrates are also metabolized in muscles and red blood cells and brain cells and so forth. So the point is, I can just say, well, I'm not going to eat processed food. Well, I can eliminate added sugar. That's one of the first places. This means soda pop. It's like, okay, now you're speaking to people's addictions here, right? It's like, I've got to have my soda. And it's like, there isn't anything healthy about a soda. There's just zero. There's nothing there. You can't even say that it's about hydration. Even if it's diet, those are worse than the regular sugar. And I realize there's some energy metabolism issues for diabetics, but I'm just speaking generally here. If you go, well, what would I drink? I'm going to look at you and say, well, how about water? I mean, let's just get, and I realize you're going to have about a 2-week transition here, but that's one really quick, easy way to go. Any food label that has added sugar, and there's like 100 different names of how they hide sugar in foods. If the food comes in a box or a package, if it's been sealed inside something, if it's been handled or processed, you can bet that it has chemicals for coloring, for emulsifying, for taste, for texture, for color, in some fashion or another. It has been processed. And you can say, but gee, that means I'm going to have to really change my diet. And it's like, maybe eventually you're going to want to do that. But like you just held up the broccoli, you just said, I made a choice here. And if I do it again and again, and I choose a salad instead of, something else on the menu, I'm going to wind up, providing my cells with the kind of energy substrate to burn that produces health as an outcome, rather than this toxified environment that impairs this communication, the signaling, these defensive networks from happening, which means I'll eventually wind up, it's like right now, if you had undiagnosed high blood pressure, would you feel it?
I don't think so.
If you had brain dementia starting, would you feel it? Because that happens 10 to 15 years prior to the diagnosis is when it starts. So the point is, there's things going on probably in every one of us right now that we can't feel. And if we wait for the symptom before we present to the physician and say, I have this problem, would you fix it? We've a lot of water's gone under that bridge. That ship sailed a long time ago. And so getting rid of processed foods, to be clean is an important part of it. And then understanding the role which there's an important role for vitamins. And if I could, let me speak to the principle of hormesis. Okay. This is spelled Hormesis. I'd love everybody just to Google it and jump on and just say, how does hormesis promote health? What hormesis is the idea that a small amount of toxicity, a minor, low dose amount of toxicity stimulates these processes, because then I adapt to them and become stronger. I become conditioned. But a high amount of those toxic agents or conditions, that will produce inflammation. Now, the great example for this, there's two examples to talk about. One is exercise. When we exercise, we're actually breaking down. I'm hurting, destroying, tearing down. It's what we call catabolic. I'm taking things apart. And then I stop exercising and I go into a phase of rest and recovery. And it's during that time when the Pac-Man comes out, the autophagy happens, I eat up all those destroyed, injured molecules, and I rebuild stronger. And so because of exercise, I become stronger. So that is a principle of hormesis, where a mild amount of stress or stressful activity can produce a positive outcome. The second illustration there has to do with what we call phytochemicals. You can think of those as vitamins or herbs or whatever, but I'm going to use the word phytochemicals or polyphenols. That's the scientific word for the chemicals that plants make in their own world when they're growing to defend themselves in their environment, in their growing environment, from their predators of oxidation or aphids or other animals eating them, because they want to stay alive and propagate. That's just kind of the rule in nature. And so they create these polyphenols in wheat, seeds, for example, beans and so forth. These polyphenols are things like phytates and lectins and so forth. And they are there to keep the seed or the bean, if you will, in dormancy until the time when it's appropriate for it to be planted, and then it needs to germinate. So you get it wet. So wetting the seed or soaking the seeds removes those, we call them anti-nutrients, those phytochemicals that were there to preserve the seed. And when we eat those before reducing the phytochemical levels to a low level, we're stressed. And, our gut doesn't work right. We have gluten insensitivities and other issues like that. But when those phytochemicals are in a small or a mild dose, when we eat vegetables that have these polyphenols, these good nutritious things in them, literally, those are subtoxic. They induce a mild amount of stress or oxidation in the cell that causes it to respond in a healthy way. That's why they're nutritious. So most all these things that make us healthy do so based on this principle of hormesis, because it's a stress adaptation. It's a stress response that makes us strong. And when we don't do it, and there's a sweet spot, there's a hormetic zone where if you have too little of it or too much of it, it's not healthy. But there's this Goldilocks sweet spot in the middle that's just right, that activates these processes in the cell. And that's why exercise is healthy. It's creating more redox, it's making more mitochondrial activity that produces more redox molecules that activate these pathway genes that make my immune system stronger. That's the pathway. And so nutrition, in the sense of eating vitamins and plants, plant-based nutrition, those have their effect in my body because of this very scientific principle called hormesis and their ability to activate my cellular defenses.
Wow.
So start with the processed food, though.
Yeah.
And then you start seeing, well, now, all this other stuff is good kind of science background, but it's like when I go to the grocery store, if it's in a box, if it's in a wrapper, if it's in a package, if it's got added sugar on it, those are the things you start to eliminate until you start to pare this down and realize, if I can go upstream in my food choices, if I'm doing more of my own cooking, if I'm eating more of those kinds of foods, my cells are going to be happier about that.
Yeah. Awesome. I feel empowered. I'm going to get into the research around redox in a moment, but you also mentioned a phrase that I'm not in nutrition or any of that kind of stuff, but you applied natural law to health and wellness. And I thought, wow, I thought this only occurred in law, the legal profession. Can you tell us why you use that phrase, natural law? And what are you trying to tell us about that?
Yeah, the word natural law, I love that word because this is about, to give this some context, we have what's called the metabolome. The OME suffix is a science term that just means the realm of. So the metabolome, the proteome, the transcriptome, the genome, we all heard that word before related to our DNA and chromosomes. And the genome affects the proteins that are made. They affect the metabolites that are made. Those are the things that you see when they take your blood and they analyze it, right? Mm. Well, there's another level or layer to this that's even deeper than the DNA or the genome, and that's called the redoxome. Redoxome. The redoxome is the world of redox. It's the redox landscape, if you will. And that is sometimes referred to as the epigenome, meaning it has influence on or it layers over the genome. We have this idea for the last 2 or 3 decades that we are our DNA. If you've got a gene for cancer, for example, well, you're just kind of destined to get cancer or whatever is in your family history. And well, that might make the slope a little steeper to walk up, perhaps, but the genome has to be expressed. The gene for those things actually have to be turned on, and we have the ability to turn them on and to turn them off. This is the new world of redox science. And we're going to see this big time over the next 2 or 3 decades, even in the pharmaceutical area, the big pharma, they're going after this, the ability to turn on and turn off switches in our DNA. And so this redoxome, this idea of what is that, that's this natural law concept of this is the command and control. This is the foundation. This is the central power, whatever words you want. You can beat your head against this wall till it's bloody, but you cannot change natural law. This is the way we were programmed. Mm-hmm. And so it goes back to the notion of, if I want to be healthy, well, then learn the rules of your cell for health, because all they're doing is reacting to what goes on. If you give them the wrong things, they're going to react in a way to give you inflammation and eventual disease. Mm-hmm. And if you give them what they need to activate these healthy pathway genes, then they're going to reward you with better health and less intervention and less aging. That your health span will be more like your lifespan. And what we have today is we start dying at age 40 or 50 or 60, but we're kept alive through medical intervention, maybe thankfully, I guess, until we're 70 or 80 or 90, whatever the day is that we drop dead. But we've been kept alive through surgeries and body part replacements and medications for all this period. What if I could live healthy right up to the week I died? It's like this idea of if my health span and my lifespan went along at the same rate, and then all of a sudden, I passed away. It's like, and hopefully in my sleep, right? It's like, this would be the ideal way to design my life. And so this natural law drives it all. And if we get in accord with that, we're going to have a better health span in our lifespan.
Yeah, that's inspiring. I can die healthy. Wow, that's inspiring indeed. Hey, look, so in your book, you surely indicate that medical researchers, science researchers are digging into redox, and you called it a technology. Where are we where is the scientific community is at understanding this technology you call redox and redox molecules? Where are we now?
That's a great question, because the question was, well, why is this suddenly coming to the forefront? Why are we suddenly talking about this? Why are physicians all of a sudden in their continuing education classes being pointed in this direction, such that they're being said, you need to look into this. This is kind of what's coming down the road. first off, anything and everything in this world right now, redox related is they're not drugs, they're not pharmaceuticals. We're not there yet. But what really brought this to the forefront, again, redox has been around for decades, but everybody kind of dismissed it. The molecular biologist said it was impossible to do anything with redox because these molecules are so highly reactive. Their lifespan is measured in milliseconds, if that. We make trillions of them every second in our cell. They're fleeting. They come into existence as an electrified molecule, such as superoxide or hydrogen peroxide or hypochlorous or ozone, nitric oxide. Those are examples of these molecules that our cell makes. And they come into existence and they extinguish, they pass their electron and they're gone. And we have to make another trillion the next second. And so it was like, there's no way that we can duplicate that. We can't make these electrolyzed saltwater chemistry. All we can do is observe it and maybe, play with it around the fringes. And then along came a research group after spending 17 years trying to actually develop a drug, because these redox molecules are very biocidal, and that's what our immune system uses to kill bacteria and viruses, for example. That's what phagocytosis in a white blood cell is all about. Is using hypochlorous and hydrogen peroxide and superoxide to neutralize microbes. Well, they said if we could find a way that we could stabilize those molecules, if we could create them in a laboratory from salt water by electrolyzing sodium chloride, which and water, which is salt water, if we could do that in that way, and we could find a way to stabilize them so there was any kind of a shelf life, then they would be usable. They would be usable in a variety of mechanisms. They were already being used in that with that kind of production facility to make disinfectants, for example. We've seen this through the recent pandemic. Hypochlorous is a very commonly used disinfectant in that regard. But biologically, it was like if we could find a way to stabilize them with it and create a shelf life for these, they could be useful in the human body. And so they tried to become a drug. This research group, a biotech group. And the problem was they could not get a drug classification for this agent because they couldn't kill anything in the laboratory, which is a requirement to get a lethal dose 50 certificate from the FDA. Then the toxic level and you can regulate it, and it becomes a regulated drug at that point. Well, that was not happening. And so this company, the research company, lost their support, their financial support, because they were trying to make a drug and flip it, to a big pharma company. And so they decided to go a different direction, and they moved it into the supplement arena. So in the FDA, the different rules apply now, and they began to find that they were able to stabilize this, and now they had something, and they reformulated it, they stabilized it, and that has now come into the marketplace in a way that we can use it as a replenishing supplement, if you will, that will increase the level of redox signaling molecules in the cell that our mitochondria are already making, but making less of as we age, because that's what happens to mitochondria. We can replenish those. And so now that has become their use in the marketplace. And that's what's opened this whole conversation up, is we finally now have a stabilized redox molecule that has some biological as well as commercial value. And so with a place in the marketplace, we now have a platform to be able to speak to these principles. And it just, as I mentioned earlier, it just so happens to turn out that these are the same identical principles which lifestyle works on. Wow. My cells get healthy when these redox pathways are activated. And that's how we get healthy, is by activating those redox pathways. That's what activates the pathway genes for health.
Yeah, this is so exciting now. As far as I know, you are the first person. Once again, I'm not a scientist or scientific researcher, but I had never seen the phrase redox lifestyle before. For whatever reason, I love it. Now, so what I gathered is that we can do the redox supplementation. We can also follow, make smart decisions with when we consume food. We're bridging redox with a healthy, lifestyle regarding foods. And I'm thinking, wow, redox. Now, could I be having it wrong? So help me out. What do you mean? That's my take from your books. But what do you mean by redox lifestyle?
I go back to that Redoxome. Think of it as the Redox Imperium. That's a Latin word that just means this is the command and control. This is the summum bonum of all of everything, is the Redox platform. That's what life is based on. If I understand those rules of how the cell works, how it wants to work when it is to work healthily, if I understand those, then the lifestyle becomes going back to your personal life and just saying, what do I need to cut out? What do I need to begin doing to obey, follow, be in harmony with, whatever word you want, the rules that the cell are programmed with? They're reactionary, in some part, but the Redoxome is nature's designed way of adapting to stresses in the environment. That's the principle. If I know the principle, then I can say, well, then how can I manage or manipulate my lifestyle, the way I conduct my life each day, the fuel that I put in my bodies to combust for energy? How can I manipulate or manage or regulate that in a way that conforms to those rules? Because if we come out the other direction, just say, well, if I've got disease, if I'm taking medication right now for anything, or if I'm troubled in my mobility or my thinking or my bowel habits or whatever, my skin issues, whatever my issues are, before those ever occur, there was a problem with the cell. And so this is walking the lifestyle back upstream to that base foundational, that upstream fountain, whatever, however phraseology works for you, so that I can live in accord with the rules of the cell for health. And if I do that, and it's not a one trick pony. It's not just a one thing. You can't just exercise. You can't just eat right. Nature was designed this way. Back in the hunter-gatherer days of our ancestors, food wasn't plentiful, and so we had to work for it. And we didn't have chemicals to put in our food to preserve it for the lean time. We stored it as fat so that we could access it later and burn it for our energy. And so we were designed this way. And if we just say, well, if those are the rules, then how can I adjust my lifestyle today to mimic those? And it includes everything from fasting, intermittent fasting, periodic low carb eating, periodic, regular exercise, sleep and airway issues. If people have sleep apnea, this needs to be looked at. If you're not getting oxygen, you're creating inflammation, and that happens every night. Oral infections, GI infections or dysbiosis. There's a lot of cylinders in the engine that have to be firing for you to have a redox lifestyle that supports those redox pathways.
I love it. The redox lifestyle. Okay. So, Dr. Ostler, is there anything else you care to share with us before we part today?
This is a thrill to speak with you, Stephen, and your audience, and hopefully, the message I would leave people is we're all agents to ourselves. We all have freedom of choice. And we also all have our own little addictions. We have those things we're accommodated to, maybe to put it kindly. And to the issue of our hormones, which are responsive and drive us sometimes. We go, well, I'm hungry. Well, there's a difference between being hungry and being hangry, right? And it has to do with these hormones. So it's like learn to ask different questions. if it's okay to be hungry periodically, or there's different ways of managing the hunger so that I don't get hangry about it, what would that look like?
Yeah.
What would I have? What fuel would I have to put in my stomach and in my bloodstream in order to not have that happen that way?
Wow.
So it's just like learning to ask some different questions and to give yourself some new permissions. This hits it hits low sometimes. It hits below the belt, as they say, because it means, well, does that mean I need to give up my soda pop? And the answer is, you have your agency.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything. We're just saying, if you desire to be more healthy, if you want true metabolic health, if you want your cells functioning and living and operating optimally, there are certain rules that have to be followed, because it doesn't care about you or your financial circumstance. It doesn't care what part of the world you grew up in. These cells are just cells. They just function based on the programming that are inherently designed in them to respond the way they do to the environment that you give them.
Yeah.
And so we're at choice. We can make those decisions. And so I would urge, anyone listening to us today to you can read the books, you can go online. I took 1,000 plus more, citations from PubMed. Almost all of the research on those two bugs came from primary sources. It's like I didn't want anybody else's interpolation to cloud that. I wanted it thought checked and fact checked. 9 ways to Sunday, as they say. And so these are the rules of the cell, and you don't have to do them. You can choose medical intervention. And I would also urge you that if you're already being intervened with using medications, don't get this wild hair idea that you can just suddenly change your lifestyle and drop all your medications. You need to do this in concert with your physician. Yeah. There's some dangerous things that can happen if you kind of get off on your own and be the Wild West cowboy, approach to this. Start wisely, start slowly, supplement wisely, get the right supplements that are appropriate. I'm always available for people if they want more information. They read the books. There's a lot of people that are advocating this Redox lifestyle now as it's starting to pick up steam and gain some momentum. And so there's a lot of resources out there where you could go so you could begin to modify your life to begin getting better help.
Okay. That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, we can find you at redoxmatters.com, your website.
There's a website there, and there's a contact area that you can reach me through that. Yes.
Okay, great. Redox molecules are available for supplementation. We can make better choices when we consume foods. That's awesome. And one last question. I tell you, I don't know anyone who has written 2 big books of a scientific nature back to back. Did you sleep while writing these books?
It is a lot of work. I mean, when this happened, 3 years ago, maybe 4 now, I got into this because my wife has had a lot of chronic health issues for a long time, and her physician mentioned to us that one of her visits, this was back in 2018, says, I think you need to get her on some redox signaling molecules. I think in retrospect, he was just scratching his head. He was trying to figure out, what do I do next for her? So he gave that recommendation. And I remember looking at him saying, I don't even know what you're talking about. And he says, just go Google it and get some. And he just, he didn't offer anything more than that, as I recall. And so I did. I found a source for a supplement, and we gave it to her. And within about 48 hours for her, it was just like flipping a switch. I mean, it was just almost overnight. Wow. And what that did to me was like, wow, for 30 plus years, we have been languishing. We have been working very diligently and compliantly with everything through, probably hundreds of physicians. We've gone everywhere to try and help her with some of her issues. And in 48 hours, this thing, what was this? And I'm just a little bit intense in my brain, I guess, because I had to figure out what just happened. What was going on here? What is redox? And that became this kind of love affair I had with this science of trying to figure out something that I couldn't get information. At the time, we had, there was some physicist type books on redox. There was a biochemistry textbook that was written by a physician out of India. There was just really nothing that would explain this. And I was having physicians come to me saying, well, what is this? Explain this to me. And I frankly couldn't. And so I just kind of hunkered down and closed the door and sat down for 2 or 3 years and produced a bibliography and some initial writings. And then they said, well, you need to make this into a book. And that's kind of when it dawned on me. It's like, if I'm going to really research it, I need to research it as though I were writing the book. And it just turned out that one thing led to the next, and I could not get the bone out of my mouth. It was like I was chewing on this thing. And I'm not sure I'm done yet, but it was kind of a labor of love to figure out how do I explain what happened to my wife and what I've seen to happen, thousands of other people, including myself. Mine wasn't quite that dramatic, but there's a reason why this science is legitimate, why it works. And in the next decade or 2 decades, we're going to see this blow up like crazy. It's going to be real fun.
That's great. Redox Matters and Healthy Matters by Dr. Lee Ostler. Dr. Ostler, it was truly my pleasure being with you today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
All right.